I need to tell you something that happened to me 18 days ago that's going to sound absolutely impossible, but I swear on everything I hold sacred that every word is true. I was sitting alone on a beach in Malibu at 50 am completely overwhelmed by terror about whether I would actually be ready if Jesus returned today, when he appeared beside me and revealed his shocking truth about what it really means to be prepared for his second coming that will challenge everything you think you know about readiness, spiritual preparation, and what he's actually looking for when he returns. What he showed me didn't just calm my fears about being unprepared. It completely revolutionized my understanding of what true readiness looks like and gave me insights about the heart of God that are more surprising and liberating than anything I'd ever imagined about the second coming of Christ. But before I begin my story, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. I just want to know I'm not alone in this. And if you feel moved by what you hear, consider subscribing. It helps give me the strength to speak my truth. Now, let's get into my story. I'm recording this from a quiet garden courtyard in Pasadena, where I'm taking a break between interviews at a Christian media conference about faith-based entertainment. It's a peaceful Saturday morning, and I'm sitting on a stone bench surrounded by blooming jasmine and towering palm trees, watching hummingbirds dart between the flowers while the gentle California breeze carries the scent of orange blossoms. The courtyard is designed in classic Spanish colonial style, with a central fountain that creates a soothing backdrop of flowing water. And there's something about this serene setting that makes you think about eternal things and the hope of Christ's return. I should be preparing for this afternoon's panel discussion about portraying Jesus authentically, but I can't focus on anything except what he revealed to me about being ready for his second coming that has completely transformed how I see spiritual preparation and what it means to live with eternal expectation. Let me tell you about the crisis that brought me to my breaking point 18 days ago. For months leading up to that morning on the beach, I had been struggling with what I can only describe as paralyzing anxiety about the second coming of Christ and whether I would actually be ready when he returns. Not doubt about his return, I believe that completely, but terror about whether my spiritual condition would be acceptable when he appeared. It started during a particularly intense period of teaching and preaching about the end times that I encountered through various Christian media, conferences, and conversations with believers who held strong views about the rapture, tribulation, and final judgment. While these weren't meant to create fear, the cumulative effect was to make me constantly question whether I was truly prepared for Christ's return or living in dangerous spiritual complacency. The specific trigger was a sermon series I heard about being ready for the second coming that painted such a demanding picture of spiritual preparation that I left feeling convinced I was nowhere near ready for Jesus to return. The preacher had described the kind of holiness, devotion, and spiritual maturity that would be required for believers to be caught up with Christ, and by his standards, I was failing miserably. When Jesus returns, he had declared with passionate intensity, he's looking for a spotless bride without wrinkle or blemish. He's coming for believers who have overcome sin, who live in perfect holiness, who spend hours daily in prayer and fasting, who have laid down every earthly attachment and live only for eternal things. If you're still struggling with sin, still attached to worldly pleasures, still falling short of perfect righteousness, you may find yourself left behind when the truly spiritual believers are taken up. His words hit me like spiritual lightning because they exposed every area where I felt inadequate in my Christian walk. Despite being a believer for decades and portraying Jesus professionally, I still struggled with pride, selfishness, and various temptations. I still enjoyed earthly pleasures like good food, entertainment, and material comforts. I still found my prayer life inconsistent and my devotional time irregular. That night in my hotel room, I began examining my spiritual condition with brutal honesty and became convinced that I was exactly the kind of lukewarm, compromised believer who might not be ready when Christ returned. I made lists of my ongoing spiritual struggles, analyzed patterns of sin that seemed to persist despite my efforts to overcome them, and became increasingly convinced that I was living in dangerous spiritual mediocrity. The fear became consuming. Every news story about global conflict made me wonder if we were approaching the end times and whether I was prepared. Every earthquake, pandemic development, or political upheaval felt like a possible sign that Christ's return was imminent and I wasn't ready. Every moment of spiritual dryness felt like evidence that I was one of the foolish virgins without oil in my lamp. I began obsessing over what true readiness looked like and whether there was enough time to achieve the level of spiritual maturity that seemed required. Should I quit acting and dedicate myself entirely to prayer and ministry? Should I sell everything I owned and live in radical simplicity? Should I fast more, pray longer, study scripture more intensively? What would it take to become the kind of believer Jesus would recognize as truly prepared? But what made the anxiety even more torturous was the uncertainty about timing and standards. Different preachers and teachers had different ideas about what constituted readiness, different theories about when Christ might return, and different standards for the spiritual condition required to be caught up rather than left behind. I read book after book about end times prophecy, studied every passage I could find about Christ's return and final judgment, and consulted commentary after commentary about the requirements for being ready. But instead of clarity, I found only more confusion about what exactly I should be doing and whether any amount of preparation would be sufficient. The crisis deepened during our filming of scenes where Jesus talks about his return, about being ready for the bridegroom's arrival, about the separation between wise and foolish virgins. Every word I spoke about readiness felt hypocritical because I wasn't confident about my own preparedness for the very event I was representing. After one particularly powerful scene where Jesus teaches about watching and being ready for his return, Dallas Jenkins pulled me aside with a concerned expression. "Jonathan, your performance was technically excellent, but something felt anxious, like you were trying to convince yourself of the readiness you were proclaiming rather than speaking from a place of genuine confidence about being prepared. Is everything okay spiritually?" His observation confirmed my worst fear. My anxiety about being ready for Christ's return was affecting my ability to authentically represent the hope and assurance that Jesus offers about his coming. That night in my trailer, I had what can only be described as an eschatological crisis that went to the heart of my understanding of salvation, sanctification, and what it means to be prepared for eternity. "Jesus," I prayed in desperation, "I'm terrified that I'm not ready for your return. I'm scared that I'm one of the lukewarm believers. You'll reject that I'm not holy enough, devoted enough, or mature enough spiritually to be recognized as truly yours when you come back. I need to know what it really means to be ready for your second coming." 3 days later, I made an impulsive decision to take a long weekend off from filming and drive to Malibu for a solo retreat focused on seeking God about spiritual readiness. Something in my spirit was crying out for clarity about preparation for Christ's return that went beyond fear-based preaching and performance-oriented spirituality. I had always found the ocean to be a place where eternal perspectives became clearer, where the vastness of creation helped put human concerns in proper context. The rhythm of waves and the endless horizon seemed like the perfect setting to honestly confront my fears about being ready for the most significant event in human history. For 2 days, I walked the beach praying about spiritual preparation, studied scripture about Christ's return and what constitutes readiness, and tried to find peace about my spiritual condition in light of Jesus' eventual return. But instead of peace, I felt increasingly agitated about my inability to achieve the level of spiritual perfection that seemed required. The more I thought about Christ returning and examining my life with perfect knowledge, the more inadequate I felt. How could I face someone who knew every sinful thought, every selfish motivation, every moment of spiritual failure? How could I claim to be ready when I knew how far short I fell of the holiness that seemed required? On my 3rd morning in Malibu, I woke up before dawn feeling more anxious about spiritual readiness than I'd ever felt in my life. The beautiful coastal setting that should have brought peace was only reminding me of how unprepared I felt for the moment when Christ would return to judge the living and the dead. Around 4:30 a.m., I walked down to the beach and found a quiet spot where I could sit alone with the sound of waves and watch the sky begin to lighten in the east. The Pacific stretched endlessly toward the horizon, and as I sat on the sand watching the day begin, I felt overwhelmed by the weight of not knowing whether I was truly ready for the most important event of my existence. That's when I did something I'd never done before. Instead of asking Jesus to help me become ready for his return, I asked him directly if I would be ready if he returned today. "Jesus," I said aloud over the sound of the waves, my voice carried away by the ocean breeze, "if you returned right now, today, in this moment, would I be ready? Would you recognize me as truly yours? Would I be among those caught up with you or among those left behind? I need to know what true readiness looks like, because I'm terrified that I'm living in spiritual complacency while thinking I'm prepared." The ocean continued its eternal rhythm, and the sky continued its gradual transition from darkness to light. I felt like I was sitting at the intersection of time and eternity, desperately needing someone to tell me honestly whether my spiritual condition would be acceptable when Christ returned. "I don't understand what it means to be truly ready," I continued, my voice breaking with months of accumulated fear. "I don't know if my ongoing struggles with sin disqualify me. I don't know if my attachment to earthly pleasures makes me lukewarm. I don't know if my inconsistent devotional life means I'm one of the foolish virgins without oil. I need you to tell me the truth about what you're looking for when you return." The silence that followed felt different from the ordinary sounds of ocean and wind. It felt pregnant with eternal significance, like the moment before the most important revelation of my spiritual life. I had moved beyond trying to prepare for Christ's return to asking whether I was already prepared. "If you're coming back for a spotless bride," I whispered, voicing the fear that had been consuming my soul, "if you're looking for believers who have achieved perfect holiness and complete spiritual maturity, then I need to know if there's still time for me to become that kind of person. Because right now, I feel like I'm nowhere near ready for the scrutiny of perfect eyes." What I didn't know was that my honest question about being ready for Christ's return was about to be answered in the most surprising way imaginable. Because at exactly 5:13 a.m., as the first rays of sunlight began to paint the Pacific horizon, the atmosphere on that Malibu beach began to shift in ways that would transform my understanding of spiritual readiness and give me access to truth about the second coming that was more liberating than anything I'd ever imagined, about being prepared for eternity. The air became thicker, more alive, charged with a presence so full of love and perfect knowledge that my fear about being unprepared began to feel small and misguided. The temperature didn't change, but reality itself felt more eternal, as if I was about to receive something that would transform not just my anxiety, but my entire understanding of what Christ is looking for when he returns. And then, sitting on the sand beside me, as naturally as if he had been watching the sunrise all along, was Jesus. His presence filled that ocean morning with such overwhelming sense of grace and acceptance that my terror about being unprepared seemed suddenly absurd. He was looking at me with eyes that held both perfect knowledge of my spiritual condition and absolute delight in what he saw. "Jonathan," he said, his voice carrying both the authority of eternal judgment and the warmth of infinite mercy, "thank you for asking about readiness instead of assuming you know what I'm looking for. Now, I can show you what it really means to be prepared for my return, and I promise you the answer will surprise you, because it's completely different from what you've been taught to fear." Jesus settled beside me on that Malibu beach, and his presence transformed the ocean morning into what felt like the most important conversation about eternity I'd ever experienced. The fear about being unprepared for his return that had been tormenting my soul began to dissolve as I realized I was about to discover what he was actually looking for when he came back. "The first truth about being ready for my return," he began, his voice filled with both eternal authority and unexpected gentleness, "is that readiness isn't about achieving perfect spiritual performance. It's about maintaining authentic relationship with me. I'm not coming back to grade your devotional consistency or measure your prayer hours. I'm coming back to gather the people who love me and love can't be faked or manufactured through religious activity. I felt something fundamental shifting in my understanding as he continued. When I return, I won't be looking at your struggle with sin to determine if you're ready. I'll be looking at your heart's response to me, despite your struggle with sin. The people who are ready are those who run to me with their failures rather than hiding from me because of their failures. This was already completely different from everything I'd been taught about spiritual preparation for his return. The second truth about being ready, Jesus said, his eyes filled with infinite love, is that the people I'm looking for aren't those who have overcome all sin, but those who have learned to live from grace rather than from guilt. Perfect holiness isn't achieved through human effort. It's received through divine gift. The readiness I'm looking for is the readiness to receive, not the readiness to perform. This hit me powerfully. I had been trying to achieve the holiness I thought he required when he was saying readiness meant being willing to receive the holiness he wanted to give. When I spoke about a spotless bride, he explained with such tenderness that I felt tears starting. I wasn't describing something my followers had to accomplish. I was describing something I would accomplish in them. The spots and wrinkles are removed by my blood, not by their effort. The bride is spotless because I make her spotless, not because she makes herself spotless. The third truth went even deeper. Being ready for my return isn't about living in constant expectation of the rapture. It's about living in constant experience of my presence. The people who are prepared aren't those who are watching the sky for my appearing, but those who are walking with me in their daily lives. Readiness is relational, not eschatological. I thought about how much energy I'd spent analyzing prophecy and watching for signs when Jesus was saying preparation happened through present relationship rather than future speculation. The wise virgins in my parable weren't wise because they calculated my arrival time correctly, he continued. They were wise because they maintained their relationship with me consistently. The oil in their lamps wasn't spiritual achievement. It was ongoing communion with me that kept their hearts burning with love regardless of delay. The fourth truth was revolutionary. The people who aren't ready for my return aren't those who struggle with ongoing sin. They're those who have given up on the possibility of being loved despite their ongoing sin. What disqualifies people isn't moral failure, but spiritual despair, not imperfection, but the belief that imperfection makes them unlovable. This completely reframed my understanding of who would be left behind when Christ returned. When I separate the sheep from the goats, he explained, the difference won't be the presence or absence of sin in their lives. It will be the presence or absence of faith in my love, despite the sin in their lives. The sheep are those who learn to run to me with their failures. The goats are those who gave up on me because of their failures. The fifth truth shocked me completely. Many of the people who think they're most ready for my return are actually least ready because they're trusting in their spiritual performance rather than in my grace. Religious pride is more dangerous than moral failure because it makes people think they don't need mercy, which cuts them off from the only thing that can make them ready. Jesus stood up and walked toward the water's edge, where the waves were gently washing onto the shore in endless rhythm. The Pharisees were the most religiously prepared people in Israel, but they weren't ready for my first coming because they were looking for someone who would validate their performance rather than someone who would offer them grace. Many believers today are making the same mistake about my second coming. This was addressing exactly the performance anxiety that had been consuming me. The sixth truth about being ready, he said, returning to sit beside me, is that readiness is measured by love, not by achievement. When I return, I won't be asking, how much did you pray, but how much did you love? I won't be measuring your spiritual disciplines, but your spiritual fruit. I won't be evaluating your religious activity, but your relational authenticity. I realized how much I'd been focused on trying to impress God with spiritual performance rather than simply loving Him and others well. The seventh truth about being ready is that it's about understanding my character, not predicting my timing. People get so obsessed with when I'm coming that they miss the point of why I'm coming. I'm not returning as a judge, looking for perfect defendants. I'm returning as a bridegroom, looking for loving bride. This was transforming my entire understanding of the second coming from fearful judgment to joyful reunion. When a bridegroom comes for his bride, he continued with such joy that I felt my fear melting completely. He's not inspecting her for flaws, he's celebrating her beauty. He's not examining her worthiness, he's expressing his love. The bride doesn't have to be perfect to be beloved. She just has to be his. The eighth truth revolutionized my understanding of spiritual preparation. Being ready for my return means living like someone who is already loved perfectly rather than living like someone who is trying to become lovable. The readiness I'm looking for is the readiness to be celebrated, not the readiness to be evaluated. I felt the weight of months of performance anxiety beginning to lift as I realized that Jesus' return was about love coming for the beloved, not judgment coming for the guilty. The ninth truth about being ready, Jesus said, his voice becoming more intense with love, is that everyone who has ever genuinely called on my name is already ready. Readiness isn't something you achieve, it's something you receive the moment you believe. You don't become ready for my return, you discover that you've been ready since the moment you first trusted me. This was the most liberating thing I'd ever heard about the second coming. When I return, he explained, I'm not coming to determine who is worthy. I'm coming to gather those who are already mine. The question isn't whether you've become good enough for me, but whether you belong to me. And everyone who has ever genuinely given their heart to me belongs to me forever. The 10th and final truth was the key that unlocked complete peace. The people who are most ready for my return are often those who feel least ready because they understand their need for grace. The people who are least ready are often those who feel most ready because they're trusting in their own righteousness rather than mine. Readiness is humility about your condition and confidence in my love. Jesus reached out and touched my heart, and suddenly I could see myself through his eyes, not as someone desperately trying to become worthy of his return, but as someone already loved, already chosen, already prepared through his grace rather than my effort. Jonathan, he said with such love that I felt my entire understanding of the second coming being transformed. You've been ready for my return since the day you first loved me. Your struggles with sin don't disqualify you, they qualify you for grace. Your awareness of your spiritual inadequacy doesn't make you unprepared, it makes you humble enough to receive the preparation I've already provided. The ocean beach fell silent except for the rhythm of waves as this truth began to heal months of anxiety about spiritual readiness. I wasn't just hearing words, I was experiencing the reality of grace that had already made me ready for eternity regardless of my ongoing spiritual struggles. But what about holiness? I asked, still trying to understand how readiness could coexist with ongoing moral failure. What about spiritual maturity? What about the warnings to be watching and ready? Jesus smiled with the warmth of someone who is about to give me the most liberating understanding of his return I'd ever received. Holiness is my gift to you, not your gift to me. Spiritual maturity is growing in your understanding of how much I love you, not growing in your ability to earn my love. Being watchful and ready means living each day from the security of knowing you're already mine, not living in anxiety about whether you might become mine. He gestured toward the vast Pacific stretching to the horizon. When I told my followers to be ready, I wasn't telling them to achieve a certain level of spiritual performance. I was telling them to live from the confidence that my love for them was unchanging regardless of when I returned. Readiness is peace about my return, not anxiety about my return. As Jesus began to fade slightly, signaling our conversation was nearing its end, he left me with the most surprising truth of all. Jonathan, if I returned right now, in this moment, you would be ready, not because of what you've accomplished, but because of what I've accomplished. Not because of how much you've grown, but because of how much I've loved you. Stop trying to become ready and start living from the readiness that's already yours. His final words came with the authority of eternal love. Remember this peace. There are millions of my followers who are tormented by fear about being unprepared for my return when they've been ready since the moment they first believed. They need to know that readiness is gift, not achievement grace, not performance love received, not love earned. As Jesus' presence began to fade from that Malibu beach, I felt like someone who had been frantically preparing for an exam and had suddenly discovered it was actually a celebration I was already invited to. The terror about being unprepared for his return that had been consuming my soul for months was completely gone, replaced by a profound sense of peace about eternity and joy about the most anticipated event in human history. "Thank you," I whispered as his form became translucent in the growing morning light reflecting off the Pacific. "Thank you for showing me that I'm not trying to become ready for your return. I've been ready since the day I first loved you." His final words came with the gentle authority of perfect grace. "Remember this piece, Jonathan. Every person who sees you living with anticipation instead of anxiety about my return will want to know how that confidence is possible. Your transformation from fear about being unprepared to joy about being already prepared will become their invitation to discover the same security about eternity." And then he was gone, leaving me alone on that beach with the most liberating understanding of Christ's return I had ever received. But this wasn't just emotional relief, it was a complete transformation of how I approached spiritual life, eternal perspective, and the hope of seeing Jesus face to face. The first thing I did was something I'd never done before. I celebrated my readiness for Christ's return instead of worrying about achieving readiness. For 2 hours, I sat on that beach and marveled at the grace that had already prepared me for eternity, recognizing that every struggle with sin was actually evidence of spiritual life rather than evidence of spiritual failure. This wasn't presumption upon grace, it was trust in the character of Christ, who had promised that everyone who believed in him would not perish, but have everlasting life. When I drove back from Malibu that afternoon, the transformation was immediately evident in how I approached every aspect of spiritual life and eternal perspective. Fear-based spiritual striving was replaced by love-based spiritual rest. Anxiety about the future was replaced by confidence in divine grace. Performance-oriented preparation was replaced by relationship-centered living. The change was dramatic when I called my spiritual director that evening to process what had happened on the beach. "Jonathan," Father Thomas said with obvious amazement, "you sound like a completely different person when you talk about Christ's return. There's something in your voice, peace, joy. Whatever happened to you in Malibu, it sounds like it resolved the anxiety about spiritual readiness that's been tormenting you for months." I shared my encounter with Jesus about being ready for his return, his shocking revelation that readiness is relational rather than performance-based, the complete transformation of my understanding from trying to achieve preparation to recognizing preparation already accomplished through grace. "That's the most mature understanding of the second coming I've ever heard," Father Thomas said with growing excitement. "You've discovered what the Church has always taught, but many believers struggle to receive, that we're prepared for eternity through Christ's work, not our work. That revelation usually takes decades to fully embrace." When I returned to the Chosen, set 3 days later, the change was immediately evident to everyone who knew me. My entire approach to portraying Jesus had shifted from anxiety about representing him perfectly to joy about representing the one who had already made me perfect in God's sight. Elizabeth Tabish was the first to comment, "Jonathan, something's completely different about your presence. You seem more confident, like you're not carrying worry about spiritual adequacy anymore. What happened in Malibu?" I shared my encounter with Jesus about readiness for his return, his revolutionary revelation that he's coming as a bridegroom for his beloved rather than a judge for the guilty, the complete transformation of my relationship with eternal preparation from terror to anticipation. "I've been struggling with similar fear about whether I'd be ready if Jesus returned," she said with obvious relief. "What you're describing sounds like permission to live from the security of already being his, rather than the anxiety of trying to become his. That's life-changing." George Xanthus overheard our conversation and joined with his own recognition. "I've been tormented by worry about the spiritual maturity required for the rapture. The idea that readiness is about receiving grace rather than achieving performance. That changes everything about how I view the second coming." When we began filming later that week, the transformation was profound. We were shooting scenes where Jesus teaches about his return, about being ready for the bridegroom's arrival, about the joy of eternal reunion with him. "That's the most authentic portrayal of someone anticipating Christ's return I've ever seen," Dallas said after we wrapped a particularly powerful scene. It didn't look like someone trying to convince people to be afraid of judgment. It looked like someone genuinely excited about the most joyful reunion imaginable. The revolution in my understanding wasn't just affecting my professional work, it was transforming every area of my spiritual life and eternal perspective. Bible study about end times became exploration of hope rather than analysis of fear. Prayer about the future became thanksgiving for security rather than pleading for worthiness. Worship became celebration of the bridegroom's coming rather than preparation for divine inspection. 2 weeks after my encounter with Jesus, I received an invitation that demonstrated how quickly spiritual transformation affects ministry opportunities. A major prophecy conference asked me to speak specifically about finding peace regarding Christ's return and understanding what true spiritual readiness looks like. "Jonathan," said the conference director during our planning call, "there's something different about how you talk about the second coming lately. You sound like someone who's genuinely excited about Christ's return rather than anxious about being prepared for it. We want you to share whatever you've discovered about being ready for eternity." The speaking engagement became one of the most liberating presentations I'd ever given, not because of prophetic insights or eschatological expertise, but because I was sharing from fresh experience of peace about Christ's return rather than trying to motivate others with fear about spiritual preparation. 18 days ago, I told the audience of 400 believers from various denominational backgrounds. I was tormented by fear about whether I'd be ready if Jesus returned today. But then he shocked me by revealing that readiness isn't about spiritual performance, it's about spiritual relationship, and anyone who loves him is already ready. The response was overwhelming. During the question period, dozens of people shared their own struggles with anxiety about the second coming, their confusion about what spiritual preparation required, their relief at hearing that readiness was gift rather than achievement. "I've been terrified about the rapture for 20 years, said Margaret Johnson, a woman in her 70s. "What you've shared today about Christ coming as a bridegroom rather than a judge that's transformed my understanding of what I've been anticipating my entire Christian life." Pastor David Martinez was moved to tears. "I've been preaching about spiritual preparation for the second coming for 15 years. But what you've shared about readiness being relational rather than performance-based, that's revolutionized how I want to help my congregation approach eternity." 3 months after my encounter with Jesus, word had spread throughout the Christian community about my transformation from anxiety about the second coming to anticipation of Christ's return. I began receiving invitations from churches, conferences, and media outlets specifically focused on helping people develop healthy, hopeful perspectives on eschatology and eternal preparation. "Jonathan," said Dr. Patricia Williams, who directed a Christian counseling organization, "your message about peace regarding Christ's return is exactly what many believers need to hear. Too many people are living in fear about the second coming when they should be living in hope about the greatest reunion in history." These speaking opportunities led to developing a comprehensive teaching ministry focused on helping Christians understand that the second coming is good news for everyone who belongs to Christ, not a source of anxiety about spiritual adequacy. 6 months after my encounter with Jesus, the transformation was evident in every aspect of The Chosen's final season. My portrayal of Jesus carried a quality of joyful anticipation about reunion with his people that wasn't threatened by their imperfections or concerned about their spiritual performance. The scenes where Jesus teaches about his return, where he promises eternal life to his followers, where he demonstrates confidence in the Father's love for believers, all of it flowed from personal understanding rather than theological performance. There's something different about how you're playing Jesus in these final episodes, observed our director of photography. When he talks about his return, he seems genuinely excited about being reunited with his people, rather than concerned about evaluating their spiritual progress. The authenticity was affecting other cast members as well. Several shared that watching my transformation had inspired them to examine their own feelings about the second coming, to question whether they'd been more afraid of Christ's return than excited about it. 1 year after my encounter with Jesus, I received a message that demonstrated the ripple effect of understanding the second coming correctly. A seminary student wrote to share that my presentation about readiness for Christ's return had completely changed his approach to pastoral ministry. I was preparing to preach about spiritual preparation for the second coming, he wrote, focusing on what believers needed to accomplish to be ready. Your revelation that we're already ready through Christ's work rather than our work has revolutionized how I want to help people approach eternity with hope instead of fear. But the most profound validation came during a conversation with Dr. Michael Chen, a theologian who had attended one of my presentations and wanted to discuss the implications of understanding the second coming as grace-based rather than performance-based. "Jonathan," he said with obvious excitement, "what you're teaching about readiness for Christ's return aligns perfectly with the core of the gospel message. You're helping people understand that the second coming is the ultimate expression of grace. Christ coming to gather those he's already made ready, not to evaluate whether they've made themselves ready." Now, sitting here in this peaceful Pasadena garden, watching hummingbirds among the flowers, almost 2 years after my encounter with Jesus about being ready for his return, I regularly speak to audiences around the world about approaching the second coming with hope rather than fear. The truths Jesus shared on that Malibu beach have become the foundation for everything I teach about eternal security, spiritual readiness, and the joy of anticipating Christ's return. Maybe you're listening to this and you recognize yourself in my story. Maybe you've been struggling with anxiety about the second coming, fear about whether you'd be ready if Jesus returned today, or confusion about what spiritual preparation actually requires. Maybe you've been trying to achieve the holiness you think he's looking for, measuring your spiritual progress against impossible standards, or living in terror about being left behind when the truly spiritual believers are taken up. I want you to know that what Jesus revealed about being ready for his return will surprise you, because it's completely different from performance-based preparation. If you love him, you're already ready. If you belong to him, you're already prepared. If you've given your heart to him, you're already his bride. The 10 truths Jesus taught me about being ready for his return have the power to transform any anxiety about the second coming into joyful anticipation. First, readiness isn't about achieving perfect spiritual performance. It's about maintaining authentic relationship with Jesus. He's looking for people who love him, not people who impress him. Second, the people he's looking for aren't those who have overcome all sin, but those who have learned to live from grace rather than guilt. Readiness means being willing to receive holiness, not achieve it. Third, being ready isn't about living in constant expectation of the rapture. It's about living in constant experience of his presence. Readiness is relational, not eschatological. Fourth, the people who aren't ready aren't those who struggle with ongoing sin. They're those who have given up on being loved despite their ongoing sin. Moral failure doesn't disqualify. Spiritual despair does. Fifth, many who think they're most ready are actually least ready because they're trusting in spiritual performance rather than grace. Religious pride is more dangerous than moral failure. Sixth, readiness is measured by love, not by achievement. When he returns, he'll be asking, how much did you love, not how much did you accomplish? Seventh, being ready is about understanding his character, not predicting his timing. He's returning as a bridegroom looking for his beloved, not a judge looking for perfect defendants. Eighth, being ready means living like someone who is already loved perfectly rather than trying to become lovable. Readiness is confidence in being celebrated, not anxiety about being evaluated. Ninth, everyone who has ever genuinely called on his name is already ready. Readiness isn't something you achieve, it's something you received when you first believed. 10th, the people most ready often feel least ready because they understand their need for grace. The people least ready often feel most ready because they're trusting in their own righteousness. If you're someone who's been struggling with fear about Christ's return or anxiety about spiritual preparation, I want you to understand that if you love Jesus, you're already ready for his return. Your struggles with sin don't disqualify you, they qualify you for grace. Your awareness of Spiritual inadequacy doesn't make you unprepared. It makes you humble enough to receive the preparation He's already provided. You don't have to achieve perfect holiness to be ready. You don't have to overcome all sin to be prepared. You don't have to earn worthiness to be His bride. If you belong to Him, you're already ready for the greatest reunion in history. Father God, I thank You for the revelation that transformed my terror about being unprepared for Christ's return into joy about being already prepared through His grace. For everyone listening who has been struggling with anxiety about the second coming, I pray that they would receive the same peace that comes from understanding readiness is gift rather than achievement. For those who have been trying to achieve the spiritual performance they think is required, help them understand that love is what you're looking for, not accomplishment. For those who have been afraid they might be left behind, help them see that everyone who belongs to Jesus is already prepared for His return. For those who have been living in fear about the second coming, help them discover that Christ's return is the ultimate expression of grace, the bridegroom coming for His beloved. Help all of us to live with joyful anticipation of Christ's return rather than anxious preparation for divine inspection. Help us to understand that we're already ready through His work, not our work. Thank You for showing us that the second coming is good news for everyone who loves Jesus, not a source of fear about spiritual adequacy. In Jesus' name, amen. The truth I learned on that Malibu beach is the truth that can transform anyone's relationship with the second coming. If you love Jesus, you're already ready for His return. Your readiness isn't based on your spiritual performance, it's based on His grace. You're not trying to become worthy of His return, you're already His beloved bride. Christ isn't returning as a judge to evaluate your spiritual progress. He's returning as a bridegroom to celebrate His love for you. You don't have to be perfect to be ready, you just have to be His. The second coming isn't something to fear, it's something to anticipate with joy. The greatest reunion in history is coming, and if you belong to Jesus, you're already invited to the celebration. Thank You for letting me share the most surprising and liberating discovery about being ready for Christ's return I've ever received. I love you all, and Jesus loves you enough to have already made you ready for the moment when you'll see Him face to face.